We're nearing the end of our grand video on the 5 bloodlines, and we've really learned how tragic the majority of these bloodlines are, or at least how kind of truly cursed they all are. But our last 2 are really a step above and outside of the others. There's so much more information on these guys. The Blood Dragons and the von Carstein vampire lines are probably the most prolific, if not widespread, vampires of the 5. The first 3 either being, clandestine, hermetic, or scarce in number. But today, we're going to talk about the von Carstein bloodline and its deep, deep roots, and not just in Hakkara, but also their direct connection to Nagash. Before we get going, I want to talk about something that a lot of people bring up, my pronunciation of von Carstein. The S in Stein is generally a SH sound. I know whenever you play the game, it's Manfred von Carstein. Apparently, according to the way Germans pronounce it, it is supposed to be von Carstein. If I wanted to be annoyingly specific, I would pronounce it, I would actually sound more like, Wald von Carstein. That is, of course, if I was driving on the Autobahn in my Bavarian motor vehicle. But I just wanted to bring this up because I know that a lot of you guys have said this in the past, like, hey, that's kind of annoying, but I want to explain it because I'm going to be saying it like so fucking much in this video. But our story begins with not Vlad von Carstein, but a man who would eventually become our favorite noseless vampire lord, Vashanesh. I can't tell if it's Vashanesh or Vashanesh, but I'm going to go with Vashanesh because it's Vashanesh. Now, we all know about nightclub Lamia, where the vampires all arose from, right? Things were really just going off there. All manner of creature of night were preying on citizens, were just kind of having free reign of the place. And this, of course, earned the ire of the rest of the priest kings. Remember, the tomb kings were called the priest kings before they became undead. So Neferata's own father sent General Setep of Kemri to put the vampires down at the head of a coalition of, priest kings. So Vashanesh was a tactician in that army. And he was said to be this brilliant and otherwise genius tactician, and the reason for a lot of his success Setep's success was Vashanesh's kind of brilliance, and they fought a number of these northern campaigns against the barbaric proto-empire in the southern regions of what would become the empire. And there was a secret behind the tactician, though. He was a blood relative of Nagash, and his allegiance lie not with the royal armies of Kemri, but with the cursed horde of Lamia. Abandoning the coalition, he warned Neferata of the impending invasion, and she was, in turn, extremely impressed with the tactician. And I mean that not just like, oh, you came to warn us? That's impressive. But it was the demeanor of Vashanesh and the way that he approached everything. He had this very cool confidence about things. He didn't just seem like a mortal. Neferata actually regards that he seemed a cut above even other vampires. So this really enthralled her. And she mentions that, oh, I fell in love at first sight. But she gives him the last bit of the elixir of life. And at the same time, she also made Vashanesh her husband, the king of Lamia. And together they reigned supreme over the vampires of the city. And they also deployed a kind of this massive shadow campaign, a Cold War almost, to prevent the coalition that was allied against them from growing. It was pretty much meant to, it was caused a lot of dissent. It resulted in priest kings growing away from each other rather than close to each other through, petty feuds and stuff like that. And this led to a multiple century delay on the invasion of Lamia. And this was put to an immediate end with the rise of the new king of Kemri, Alcatazar the Conqueror. This guy was a veritable badass who would go on to be the one that slew Nagash during his second rise, that is. But Alcatazar actually has a pretty dark past we'll go into as well, but he unifies Hakkara to attack Lamia, and in doing so, puts down the vampire capital, sending its inhabitants to flight, as we all know by this time, right? This is the 4th time I'm having to tell you guys this. But this is the crux of, well, not the crux. I'm going to say that word too much in a little bit, but this is the linchpin. Lamia is the linchpin of the beginning of all of the vampire bloodlines. So it's always worth rehashing this part of the story because any of you might come in sideways on these. So I want to make sure you do have that background. But the fleeing vampires were then led to Nagash, who made Vashanesh the leader of all vampires. And this, of course, pissed off Neferata. But when When is she really not mad, as we've kind of seen from her lore? But to him, Nagash gifted to Vashanesh, Nagash gifted a ring that would make the user truly immortal, able to come back from any type of death. And the ring also gave Nagash, and Arkan the Black alternatively, dominion over the entire vampire race. And the vampires were initially, they're pretty stoked on this, on serving Nagash and getting a chance to get revenge on their conquerors. And this excitement quickly turned to resentment as Nagash kind of uses their lives haphazardly and dashing the vampires into losing engagements at times, or for the most part, just really not cherishing their life above that of other skeletons or zombies. So Vashanesh, the clever kind of future von Carstein that he was, took to finding a way to undermine the rule of the king, a quote unquote on that. Of the ring. He discovered in time that it required a living vampire to wear for the ring to actually work, for that little dominion portion of it to work. So he forced himself into a fight with Alcatazar, and Alcatazar actually slays Vashanesh. But this in turn freed all the vampires from Arkan and Nagash's rule. And immediately they all fled, for the exception of Wasauron, who we already talked about was overly devout to Nagash. And they all kind of, traveled the world and set up their own bloodlines, and or the future of those bloodlines and the infamy. We talked about 4 already, and we're going to talk about the blood dragons, but the other 2 and how they go into Cathay or into the northern Chaos Wastes. Just all kind of depends on where everyone goes. In time, though, Vashanesh returned from the dead, just as Nagash said he would. Taking to the north, Vashanesh settled in Kislev and took on a new name, Vladimir. There, he went about studying magic to try and learn how to break the hold on the vampire race as a result of this ring. For if Vladimir wore the ring, it would give Arkan the Black dominion over the vampires in the Arch Necromancer's stead. So he needed a way to kind of end this tie, sever this tie. So eventually, Vladimir made his way south to Sylvania, a land he has come to truly appreciate, or had come to truly appreciate during his time as Setep's tactician way back a lifetime and a half ago. But remember, he has seen the entirety of the Badlands, the Border Princes, and most of the southern regions of the Empire before they were, well, again, the Empire. And he's seen these barbarians rise from the mud and into these sprawling cities. So it's a very impressive thing for him. And he kind of grows this increasing fascination with the Empire and this kind of strong desire to become the Emperor, which manifests way later in his life, of course, as we'll talk about. But I think this is where that initial kind of romance begins between the land of the old world and Vashanesh, and his kind of fascination with it. But to give you a sense of time, this is roughly 111 IC, and we know this because Vladimir meets up with Frederick von Hall, who you might know his name from the spell Van Hel's Dance Macabre. But some background here, this is during the Great Skaven Wars, when the Black Death swept through a good portion of the Empire and knocked out a gigantic swath of the population. I mean, the Skaven rose from their under empire to attack the old world en masse. The Black Death was obviously orchestrated by the little skittering creatures, and like I was saying, it claimed millions. Even the current yet incompetent Emperor Boris Goldgatherer died from this plague. Roughly 3/4 of the population of the Empire was completely wiped out. So, of course, left a slew of dead that could be, coaxed into doing things, for an enterprising necromancer. Enter Frederick von Hall, an enterprising necromancer, a priest of Mor that was then taught necromancy by Vladimir, and he used this to summon a shambling horde against a skittering horde pouring out of the mountains around Sylvania. And this conflict went on for a good portion of the 13-year-long war. 13 years with the Skaven, like you guys didn't see that coming. But this all ended when Lothar von Deal, von Hall's apprentice, assassinated the Baron. And this, of course, kept the door open for the new emperor out of Middenheim, Mandred Skavenslayer, to finish off the kind of weakened and already kind of scattering Skaven. But to wrap up this little story, Mandred was slain by a handful of years after by a Clan Eshin assassin. But this is the conflict that started the Skaven don't exist credo by the witch hunters. And speaking of witch hunters, Van Hel's family, as he was known when he became a necromancer, he took on the name Van Hel. But his family were ashamed at their progenitors kind of flagrant use of necromancy, honestly, and took up a vow to constantly hunt evil as witch hunters, thus spawning the Warhammer Van Helsing in its entirety. And we go on to see more and more and more of these witch hunters, and the current Grand Inquisitor Captain Witch Hunter is of the Van Hel bloodline. So it's a small little side story to this, but I think it's a really cool one. I really wanted to tie it in here. But back on track. Vladimir disappears from history now for like 700 years. He just kind of, slips into obscurity. And that is until he appears in Sylvania in the year 1500 something IC. And there, Otto von Drac is slowly dying away. He was the last in a long line of mad counts that ruled Sylvania, poorly, might I add, impaling peasants on a whim, and, no one really was loyal to him. None of his lords liked him or cared much about him. So Otto's brother, Leopold, was next in line to become the Elector Count, as there were no male heirs to take the reins, and Leopold was a bastard of a man as it was, and Otto wasn't stoked on this. But Vlad von Carstein showed up on the eve of Otto's last night, married Otto's daughter, Isabella von Carstein, well, soon to be Isabella von Carstein, and became the ruler of Sylvania overnight. And Vlad is described in the books as having a Kislev accent, or even further east than that. So it's right to assume he has a slightly Slavic accent, as well as looking like the kind of cliche Dracula vampire, Well-dressed, short black hair, very noble in his stature, and all used as a facade to hide this kind of beast within. And they talk a little bit about how there's the scant moments in which he gets in combat, how this big mercenary band comes to essentially Castle Drakenhof and is like, hey, we are going to take this on over. You guys have to pay us to leave. And Vlad himself goes out there without his bodyguard to help him and single-handedly kills the leader of the mercenary than the entire band. And everyone's like, oh god, Vlad might be a way better swordsman than we thought. So people, they don't live in fear of him, but they know that if something happens, he's gonna smack that ass. So Isabella was turned into a vampire shortly after this all began, but she was already madly in love with Vlad, which may or may not have been an enchantment. The books don't really say, but I could see it as maybe starting that way and then kind of panning out the way we see it now. But this is what I'm about to say is conjecture, so I'm not the lore meister for a second. So this is just conjecture, but I take the curse of vampirism in Warhammer as enhancing the kind of most front-facing aspect, or maybe even emotion, of someone before they become a vampire. We look at Abhorrash and his sense of honor and duty, and how that's the crux of his bloodline. Ambition is the center point for von Carstein's, ruling over people, some sort of like monarchy for Strigoi, the thirst for knowledge and the arcane for Neckarchs, and ceaseless revenge / getting even for Lamians. Vashanesh goes from a pretty even-handed individual to an immensely, almost overly ambitious character, biding his time to kind of make the right move. And this is when he becomes a vampire. And we already see that his kind of act to become a vampire, or not to become a vampire, but to link up with Lamia during the time of Neferata, is almost like a power move, an ambitious power move. He becomes a vampire shortly after that. Okay, does it amplify that kind of face value right there? So Isabella seems to be more in love with Vlad as a result of this being a primary part of her life as she kind of descended into vampirism. So I'm not really sure that they don't really go into depth on the nature of vampirism in Warhammer. There is the Book of the Dead, and how it talks about how, like, what aspects of a man, that like there's like 7 aspects of a living creature, and how each stage of undeath has certain one of those aspects missing. Like a vampire's all of them minus the soul or something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I digress. So for 10 some years, Vlad went to turning Sylvania into an idyllic empire state for the most part. He was killing off nobles that opposed him and converted the rest into vampires. And these Sylvanian peasants were actually very happy under Vlad's rule. And slowly but surely, though, things were kind of going on behind the scenes. All of the major cults of the empire had been driven from the land, with a new cult, the cult of the arisen dead, appearing in their stead. This cult venerated and almost worshipped the dead that Vlad had risen to walk the land and actually protect the peasants. Sylvania was being choked with mass amounts of death, and this was their answer: full allegiance to that dead. And over the years, people began to suspect something as the Sylvanian aristocracy never really aged, and a whole generation had come and gone with people being suspect of Vlad, that whole time. Like, I think there's a portion in the lore where they talk about a girl saying, my grandmother says, or someone's granddaughter, my grandma said when she was a little girl, her mom remembers when Vlad came into power. So it's like it's already skipped this 2-3 generational gap, and Vlad's still, spry as ever. So this leads to the Great and First Vampire War. Now, we've already gone over this conflict in another video, but to summarize, Vlad leads a limitless undead army out of Sylvania across the empire. And his goal is to capture the city of Altdorf and become the new emperor. Again, we talked about that kind of fascination with constant ambition and growth. And he sacks almost every major city on his way. I mean, he goes to Middenheim, to Nuln, and he even converted the Grand Master of the Knights of the White Wolf, Jarek Kruger, to vampirism. So he's having a field day. So the final battle happens on the walls of Altdorf, where Grand Theogenes Wilhelm III, or Wilhelm, as I said, fights against Vlad in a one-on-one duel. The night prior, Manfred von Carstein, who's an asshole even early in the lore, tells Wilhelm that in order to kill Vlad, you need to take his ring. And sometime over all these centuries, Vlad had broken the attachment to Nagash that the ring had once granted him. His von Carstein family signet now giving him simply eternal everlasting life, which is put into test many times during the wars, including, when he gets his head shot clean off by a cannonball, but hoo-hoo-hoo! So, when the Theogenist squared off with his undead foe, Vlad's ring was stolen by Felix Mann the night before. And Felix Mann is this kind of renowned thief, known for being able to steal anything. So their duel ended by Wilhelm throwing himself from the battlements, grabbing Vlad, and bringing them both down. And they end up landing on a wooden stake that impales through Vlad into Wilhelm, pinning Vlad down onto the ground. And alas, that there passes the first of the von Carstein bloodline. From there, we know what really some of the more prolific players in the von Carstein bloodline. Manfred von Carstein, Conrad von Carstein, who goes to propagate the Second Vampire War and is again kind of double-crossed. Doesn't quite make it as far as Vlad does because he's too blood crazy. But we have this whole extremely huge line of von Carstein vampires that are extremely important to the grander lore of Warhammer. Noctilus, Niklaus von Carstein, is a von Carstein vampire. We know that all of these characters play so heavy. Like there's Peter von Carstein, who is a huge part of another character's lore. But the von Carsteins and the Blood Dragon vampires spend the most time embroiled in other races' lore. And that is very important. And that kind of dictates the importance of a character to the grander scheme of the Warhammer lore. That's why Manfred von Carstein has been around for so long, is because he's in everyone's lore pretty much, as somewhere or another, just pulling some sort of string or just fucking something up. I mean, look at the Blood Dragons. You've got Walash von Carstein, Walash Harkin. You've got Luther Harkin. You've got the Blood Keep. You've got the Blood Knights, who actually, in 8th edition, the Blood Dragon vampires seem to kind of fall to the wayside in exchange for the Blood Knights, which are Blood Dragon vampires in a distant way. So everyone kind of has their place, and the von Carstein vampires always kind of stood out amongst the other bloodlines because they're the most identifiable vampire. They look the very old, like some of the oldest von Carstein models just straight up look like a Dracula model put into the Warhammer world, like exact carbon copy. So we've seen these guys added now to Total War Warhammer 2 with the Curse of the Vampire Coast DLC. And the role that the von Carsteins play throughout their history is very much a puppet master. They're always at the head of some massive army that has a plan that is outside of like the motivations of what would seem otherwise very transparent. We look at Manfred von Carstein throughout the end times and how he uses his army almost like one grand puppet, throwing them into the fray so that he can do something else in the background. And we see this with Total War Warhammer 2, handsome, arrogant, and charismatic. The von Carsteins are the true masters of men and beasts. And this gives them access to casualty replenishment rate, to public order, because they spent such a long time solidifying and making sure that Sylvania is their true home. Also gaining access to Sylvanian crossbowmen and handgunners. And again, this plays so heavily into that role that of again, almost like Vlad Tepish, right, where we see this what is outwardly seen as a tyrant by the rest of, like, you know, the world. To the Romanian people, Vlad Tepish is a hero. To the Sylvanian people, the von Carsteins aren't, yeah, sure, they're absolutely terrifying, but at the same time, they're also seen as these grand saviors of people that were able to bring around Sylvania into the better portions of kind of like the empire psyche. Because, like I was saying, at that time when Otto von Drack was just this mad count killing people, no one really liked him very much. Let's take a look here at the bloodline abilities for what's it called, for the tabletop. So the bloodline abilities for the von Carstein don't exist, in the sense that they don't, if you are a von Carstein vampire, you get no innate bonuses or detractors to your stat line. This was basically the D&D humans of the vampires. Hey, these guys, you're going to choose these guys, and they're not going to have anything different about their stat profile. They just play the same. Don't worry about it. Don't have to worry about changing anything. So these guys, even says von Carstein vampires are the archetypical vampires of the old world. They have a number of abilities here. They've got summon bats. The vampire produces a bestial howl that awakens dark creatures and beckons them to his aid. Of course, bringing bats. And we also see that you can get hell bats with 0 upkeep and 0 recruitment cost in the von Carstein armies of Total War Warhammer, playing right into that. Call winds. The anger of a von Carstein is so powerful that even the sky reflects it. And this reflects the ability to use like that Bloodstorm ability that summons up a vortex that damages both ground and air units. It's not quite that way in the tabletop, but again, it's given that kind of that nod to it at the same time. Walking death. So powerful is the unholy presence of the vampire that mere mortals are forced to flee in terror. This just basically means that anytime you get in combat with a von Carstein vampire, you get an additional +1 to your combat resolution, which doesn't really have a huge bearing on a computer game. But summon wolves. These beasts are slaves to the implacable will of the von Carstein blood. You would actually see these on the tabletop, is you'd see a 2 wolves that you would then use if you were going to play space wolves, but you'd use these wolves for your von Carstein vampire if you decided to summon them. Aura of Dark Majesty, which we see as well in the game already. The von Carsteins are the most authoritative of the vampires, the best generals among their kind, and they actually can increase their leadership range by 6 inches, which we again already see. Wolf form. The vampire can change his shape to that of a wolf. Now, again, we cannot see, this is not in the game, but it is pretty cool here that it basically just means that they have increased movement speed in the tabletop. It didn't mean that they were turned into an actual wolf that had a different stat line and characteristics, but nonetheless, it's still a pretty cool little feature of, again, the vampires. When you think of stuff like Castlevania and you think of that level of, to me, Castlevania is my baseline for vampires, and Rice vampires for that matter too. But the Warhammer vampires have always been the coolest ones to me because they're brutal. They're gentlemen killers. Like, I really love the way that Warhammer's portrayed vampires. But the von Carsteins so closely resemble Castlevania vampires. I mean, you could play straight up Alucard in this if you wanted to, you know, if you're familiar with that lore. So the von Carstein have always been a really kind of cool vampire bloodline to me, but the Blood Dragon always will reign supreme. So that is our next video, guys, is the Blood Dragon vampires. We'll be talking about Abhorash. Hope you enjoyed this segment on Vashanesh, the von Carsteins, and their kind of rise and fall, as well as kind of also somewhat medium plateauing right now. But this covers everything about them. Hopefully, if you have any questions, go ahead and let me know below. I'm always happy to answer those questions for you guys. But we will have that video coming out on Friday for the Blood Dragons, and I'll be making probably a post on the Reddit to kind of culminate everything into each and every single individual bloodline here. But thanks so much for joining me on this bloody journey as we go through our vampire bloodlines. But when we talk about the Blood Dragons, we will be talking about the 2 missing, perceived missing bloodlines at the end of that video. There's not a whole lot of them. There are actually only scant mentions in the lore, so we'll just go quickly into those before we wrap up that video. But be on the lookout for that video on Friday, guys. In a little bit here, we will have the Warpstone Cup Grand Cup going. I intentionally did Warpstone Cup Grand Cup because it's supposed to be Skaven-y. But that'll be going at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, so be on the lookout for that. Catch that stream, and you can watch 4 players just duke it out in a grand flash tournament. But as always, guys, don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, check out Patreon, all that kind of stuff. But have a good one, and take care.